Jeff Henry never graduated high school. He had no engineering degree, no background in physics, no formal training in structural design. What he had was a family water park empire, a mountain of debt, and a promise, made on camera to a reality TV crew, that he would build the tallest water slide in human history. The design took 36 days. During testing, 110-pound sandbags loaded into the rafts went airborne, flew off the track, and crashed into the dirt below. Henry's solution was not to demolish the ride. It was to build a cage of metal hoops and heavy netting directly over the flight path. On August 7, 2016, a 10-year-old boy weighing 74 pounds sat in the front seat of a raft on that slide, lighter than the sandbags. The ride was called Verrückt, German for insane. Before the cage, before the sandbags, before any of it, there was the pitch. In September 2005, Jeff Henry and the Schlitterbahn Water Parks family announced a $750 million destination resort on 370 acres of flat Kansas prairie in western Wyandotte County. Not a water park, a vacation village, interconnected attractions, dining, retail, a riverwalk district, and 1,800 hotel rooms, all anchored by the company's signature river-based ride system and designed to pull tourists from a 4-state radius. Local officials lined up behind it. Mayor Joe Reardon promised 3,000 jobs and $90 million in annual payroll. The rendering showed something like a small city organized entirely around moving water. The Henrys had earned the credibility to make that pitch. Their Schlitterbahn parks in Texas, New Braunfels and South Padre Island, ranked among the most popular regional water parks in the country, built on a concept they trademarked as transportainment. Instead of queuing for individual rides and concrete stairwells, guests floated through interconnected rivers and mechanical conveyor belts called aquavers that carried them between attractions without ever climbing out of the water. No sunburned shoulders baking in a line that didn't move. No 45-minute waits on hot steps with nothing to look at but the back of someone else's neck. The tube did the walking. It was clever engineering dressed as effortless fun, and it was the foundation of everything Schlitterbahn had ever built. Kansas City was supposed to prove the brand could dominate beyond Texas. Henry chose the site for its proximity to Kansas Speedway and the Village West retail corridor. But the deeper draw was a financing mechanism called Star Bonds, sales tax and revenue bonds that let the state and county divert future tax revenue to pay for private development. Build a destination that pulls out-of-state tourists across the Missouri border, capture the sales tax those tourists generate, use that revenue to service the bonds that funded construction. The park would pay for itself, on paper. Then the 2008 recession hit, and the $750 million vacation village collapsed into a $180 million standalone water park. No hotels, no retail village, no year-round resort components. Just the 40-acre first phase, opening in July 2009 with about 24 slides and chutes, a handful of rivers, and the transportainment system that had always been the brand's identity. To fill out the ride roster and cut costs, Henry shipped in 3 attractions from the recently shuttered Geauga Lake Park in Ohio, fading Midwestern fiberglass bolted alongside new Texas-engineered water coasters in the middle of the Kansas prairie. It was enough to be fun. Visitors during those early seasons stepped into a sun-drenched maze of canary yellow and deep blue fiberglass tubes snaking across artificial river basins carved into the flat suburban sprawl. The air hung heavy with humidity and the chemical bite of industrial chlorine, laced with the sugary drift of funnel cake batter from concession stands near the wave pool. Mechanical pumps roared behind every bend, pushing thousands of gallons uphill through the Storm Blaster water coasters. Kids drifted the Crystal River in oversized tubes, while their parents floated behind them, wristbands tight on sweaty arms, bare feet dragging in water that never quite cooled down. The fiberglass baked in the sun. The parking lot shimmered. The park hired roughly 300 seasonal workers, teenagers pulling shifts as lifeguards and tube handlers for wages that barely covered gas money. And for a few summers, it worked exactly the way a regional water park should work. The crowds came, the rivers ran, the funnel cakes sold. But Jeff Henry hadn't just built a $180 million water park. He'd built a $180 million water park carrying a $174 million mortgage held by EPR Properties, a Kansas City-based real estate investment trust, with additional exposure against $85 million in star bonds that had been sized for a $750 million resort economy that no longer existed. The park was solvent. The financial architecture underneath it was not. That financial pressure is the origin of everything that followed. Henry needed a headline, something that would put Schlitterbahn, Kansas City on a national stage without the capital expenditure of building out the hotel and resort phases the recession had killed. New lazy rivers and family-friendly expansions wouldn't generate the kind of attention required to service $174 million in mortgage notes when the original business plan assumed year-round hotel revenue, destination retail traffic, and tax generation at 4 times the current operating scale. The gap between what the park earned and what its inherited debt structure demanded required a spectacle, fast, cheap, and impossible to ignore. In November 2012, Jeff Henry found one. Standing at an amusement industry trade show with a Travel Channel reality TV crew rolling, he announced the world's tallest water slide, 17 stories, faster than anything ever built. A ride so extreme it would generate morning show segments, Guinness validation, and viral press, the kind of free national publicity that a $180 million seasonal water park in Kansas could never buy through advertising alone. Henry committed to the concept, not because an engineering team had validated the physics, not because hydrodynamic modeling had confirmed the forces, but because a camera was on him, and the promise was spectacular. And then it had to actually get built. Henry handed the design to John Schooley, a longtime business partner with no engineering degree, no physics background, and no credentials in ride system design. A slide at the scale Henry had promised, 168 feet, 7 inches tall, generating speeds near 70 miles per hour, with multi-person rafts, demanded what the industry calls dynamic engineering. Months of mathematical modeling, calculating the interaction of weight, velocity, friction, and centripetal force at every point on the ride profile. The standard timeline for that work is 3 to 6 months, performed by credentialed engineers using simulation software and testing protocols refined over decades of commercial ride design. Henry and Schooley finished in 36 days. The grand jury indictment later described the method as crude trial and error. No formal dynamic calculations were run. No outside engineering firm was retained. In internal emails pushing for speed, Henry wrote, "Time is of the essence. No time to die." By April 2014, while the ride was still being reworked after testing failures, Schlitterbahn had already secured Guinness World Record certification for the structure's height, locking in the marketing before the engineering was resolved. Schooley would later acknowledge the absurdity of what they had attempted. "If we actually knew how to do this," he said, "and it could be done that easily, it wouldn't be that spectacular." Kansas guaranteed that no external authority would intervene. At the time Verrückt was conceived and built, the state required no direct approval of ride design, no mandatory compliance with ASTM international safety standards, and no independent state inspection of operating amusement rides. The Kansas Department of Labor had exactly one Schlitterbahn inspection record on file, a 2012 records audit conducted before Verrückt existed. The regulatory framework relied entirely on the park hiring its own inspector, reviewing its own records, and certifying its own safety. Nobody stopped them. Schlitterbahn's development team had worked state and local officials to maintain a regulatory environment friendly to rapid construction, the same officials whose star bond approvals and economic development projections depended on the park's continued expansion and positive press. The result was a closed loop. The park designed the ride. The park built the ride. The park tested the ride. The park inspected the ride. The park certified the ride safe. At no point in that chain did anyone without a financial interest in opening day have the authority or the obligation to say stop. 2 months before the fatal incident, an insurance-related inspector examined Verrückt and deemed it insurable, meaning the premiums adequately priced the risk as the insurer modeled it. Insurability is not safety certification. It does not mean a child can ride at 70 miles per hour and survive. By early 2014, Verup's concrete towers stood against the flat Kansas sky, and Henry's trial-and-error method moved from blueprints to physics. During late-night test runs, 110-pound sandbags were loaded into the multi-person rafts and sent down the 17-story drop. The rafts hit the valley at the bottom of the first plunge, rocketed up the secondary 50-foot hump, and the sandbags went airborne. Not once, repeatedly. They flew off the flume and smashed into the ground below. The velocity and negative g-forces at the crest of that secondary hill simply overwhelmed the available downforce on any load light enough to matter. The physics were clear. A hired safety consultant surveyed the unfinished ride and told Henry directly, Verrucht was fundamentally unsafe and incomplete. The consultant recommended no rider under the age of 16. For a brief window, the trajectory appeared to bend. Henry halted the opening. Schlitterbahn spent roughly $1 million to tear down a section of the lower slide, reduced the drop angle from 45 degrees to 22, and extended the bottom hump by 5 feet to bleed off speed. A 14-year-old minimum age restriction was put in place. These were genuine structural changes, not cosmetic adjustments. For a moment, it looked like the physics might actually win the argument. None of it worked. Rafts continued to display what internal documentation described as a persistent airborne problem at the crest. The velocity at the transition point still overwhelmed the downforce on lighter loads. $1 million, and the fundamental physics hadn't changed. Henry's response was to stop trying to fix the aerodynamics and start trying to contain what the aerodynamics produced. A cage of metal hoops and heavy netting was constructed directly over the section of the slide where rafts went airborne, the flight path itself. Under ASTM standards, placing a rigid obstruction in the flight path of a ride operating at those speeds is categorically prohibited. ASTM standards were not legally binding in Kansas. The restraint system made the exposure worse. A ride generating Verrucht's forces required Class 5 rigid over-the-shoulder harnesses, the kind used on roller coasters that invert riders or produce extreme negative g-forces. Verrucht used Velcro straps. Riders reported them coming undone during the 17-story freefall, forcing them to cling to the raft's molded handles to avoid being thrown from the vehicle entirely. The straps created the visual impression of a restraint without the mechanical function of one. Days before the grand opening in July 2014, Henry removed the age restriction entirely. The safety consultant's recommendation of 16 had already been lowered to 14 during the redesign. Now it vanished. The ride that couldn't keep 110-pound sandbags on the track was open to children. Between July 2014 and August 2016, Verrucht produced at least 13 documented non-fatal injuries: concussions, herniated spinal discs, whiplash, broken toes, a head laceration, facial and orbital fractures. A 15-year-old girl went temporarily blind from the G-forces and head trauma. Each injury confirmed what the sandbags had demonstrated during testing. The airborne behavior at the crest had never been fixed. The physics hadn't changed. The riders had simply replaced the sandbags. Operations Director Tyler Miles oversaw the institutional response. Rather than shutting the ride down, Miles allegedly directed teenage lifeguards to alter incident reports, suppressing the documented injury pattern from outside scrutiny. The paper trail that should have forced regulatory intervention was being erased by the people generating it. Meanwhile, the marketing machine Henry had built the ride to feed ran flawlessly. The Travel Channel aired heavily produced segments. Amusement Today awarded it a golden ticket as Best New Water Park Ride. None of that validation had anything to do with the ride's engineering. It had to do with its height. August 7, 2016 was Elected Officials Day at Schlitterbahn, Kansas City. State legislators and their families received complimentary admission, a promotional gesture from the company to the officials who had approved its star bonds and shaped its regulatory environment. Among the guests was Kansas State Representative Scott Schwab. He brought his family. His son Caleb was 10 years old and weighed 74 pounds. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, Caleb boarded a Verrucht raft and was placed in the front seat. Behind him sat 2 adult women he did not know, weighing 275 and 197 pounds respectively. The combined raft weight, 546 pounds, fell 4 pounds under the 550-pound maximum. The weight distribution was catastrophic: 74 pounds in the front of the raft, 472 pounds in the rear. The raft descended the 17-story drop and accelerated to approximately 70 miles per hour. The Velcro straps provided no structural restraint. At the bottom of the valley, the raft began its violent ascent up the 50-foot secondary hump. The massive rear weight compressed the back of the vessel, driving the center of gravity backward. At the crest, the exact point where the negative G-forces were greatest, the exact point where the sandbags had always gone airborne, the lightweight front end of the raft had nothing holding it to the water's surface. The front of the raft lifted off the flume. The metal cage was directly above. Caleb Schwab struck the steel hoops and heavy netting at approximately 70 miles per hour. The impact was immediately fatal. The cause of death was decapitation. The raft slammed back onto the flume and completed the course to the run-out pool. The two women in the rear survived with severe facial trauma, a broken jaw, orbital fractures, deep lacerations from impact with the netting structure. Verrucht never operated again. The Schwab family reached a civil settlement totaling approximately $19.7 million, roughly $25 million in today's dollars. The payout came from a matrix of defendants: $14 million from two Schlitterbahn-affiliated entities, $5 million from Henry & Sons Construction, $500,000 from raft manufacturer Zebek of North America, and $232,125 from the aquatic safety consultant and its founder. The two women injured in the raft reached separate settlements whose terms were not publicly disclosed. Caleb's father channeled his grief into the regulatory system that had failed his son. Kansas lawmakers overhauled the Kansas Amusement Ride Act, adding mandatory permitting, stronger inspection requirements by qualified outside inspectors, expanded record-keeping obligations, and a statutory requirement for attendance at water-propelled slides 15 feet or taller. The law that had allowed two men with no engineering credentials to design, build, test, and self-certify a 17-story slide was replaced with something approaching actual oversight. Scott Schwab later became Kansas Secretary of State. The criminal case aimed higher. In 2018, Wyandotte County grand juries indicted Jeff Henry, John Schooley, Tyler Miles, KC Water Park Management, and Henry & Sons Construction on charges including reckless second-degree murder, involuntary manslaughter, aggravated battery, aggravated child endangerment, and interference with law enforcement. The indictments portrayed Verrucht as a slide developed without sufficient technical qualifications, rushed for publicity, and operated despite known airborne behavior, tracing the danger back to the earliest tests, the 110-pound sandbags that flew off the flume, the same physics that remained unresolved when a 74-pound boy boarded the ride 2 years later. Two maintenance workers, David Hughes and John Zalzman, went to trial first on obstruction charges related to statements about brake mat maintenance. A jury acquitted both in October 2018. Then the entire prosecution collapsed. Kansas Attorney General Derek Schmidt had made a decision during grand jury proceedings that would undo the case. The state had shown jurors heavily dramatized footage from the Travel Channel's Extreme Water Parks, the same show that had been filming when Henry first announced the ride at the 2012 trade show, and presented it as factual evidence of the developer's recklessness. The prosecution had also elicited expert testimony suggesting that ASTM international standards were legally binding in Kansas, when state law at the time of Verrucht's construction imposed no such requirement. In February 2019, Judge Robert Burns dismissed all remaining indictments. The grand jury had been irreparably tainted. Burns called the Travel Channel footage fictional and dramatized. The ASTM testimony had misrepresented the applicable legal standard. The defendants, Burns wrote, were not afforded the due process protections and fundamental fairness Kansas law requires. The dismissal was procedural, not substantive, a ruling on prosecutorial conduct, not a clean bill of health for the ride or its designers. Burns noted that the state could pursue charges again using proper evidence. It never did. The television show that made Jeff Henry want to build the ride is the same footage that kept him out of prison. Henry was arrested later that year in a Kansas hotel room. The charge was possession of methamphetamine with intent to distribute. He received 36 months of probation. He never served a single day in prison for any charge connected to the death of Caleb Schwab. The criminal case was not the only system that failed under scrutiny. In 2018, acting under the tightened amusement ride laws passed in the wake of the tragedy, the Kansas Department of Labor inspected Schlitterbahn, Kansas City's remaining rides. Everything except Verrückt, which had been closed since the fatality. Inspectors found 147 items requiring immediate corrective action across 11 attractions. Incomplete manuals, missing maintenance records, inadequate signage, overdue replacement parts, including the main drive cable on the Soaring Eagle zipline. 4 rides were ordered shut. Others reopened only after remediation work was completed. The safety failures at Schlitterbahn, Kansas City extended far beyond a single slide. The park limped through its final operating season and closed its gates on September 3, 2018. It never reopened. When Cedar Fair acquired Schlitterbahn's profitable Texas parks for $261 million in 2019, the Kansas City property was not included in the operating deal. Cedar Fair received only an option to purchase the 40-acre site for $6 million. The company let that option expire. $261 million for the Texas parks, $6 million for the right to think about Kansas City. EPR Properties reported full repayment of roughly $189.7 million in mortgage obligations, including accrued interest on the original $174 million principal by mid-2019. But the repayment came through asset liquidation and corporate restructuring, not through a recovering Kansas City operation. The Star Bond issuance of $85.2 million still carries a remaining balance of nearly $75 million in current Kansas Department of Commerce records. Kansas taxpayers are still servicing debt on a park that no longer exists. Verrückt's tower stood for 2 years after the fatality, a 17-story crime scene wrapped in chain-link fencing, its yellow fiberglass fading to a chalky white under the Kansas sun, the metal hoops weeping rust down the length of the chute. It was demolished in late 2018. The rest of the park followed. By late 2021, every tower, every river basin, every fiberglass tube, every transportainment conveyor had been scraped from the earth and hauled away. Homefield LLC acquired the site and built an amateur sports complex. Nothing remains of Schlitterbahn, Kansas City, except stretches of cracked parking lot asphalt and the concrete base of the entrance sign. The ground where Verrückt stood now holds soccer fields and batting cages. No marker, no memorial, no trace of the 17-story staircase or the metal cage at its crest. The $75 million Star Bond balance is still being paid. If you grew up going to water parks, if you remember the chlorine and the sunburn, and the feeling of a slide that seemed just a little too fast, did you ever look at a ride and think, "There's no way this is safe"? Did you ride it anyway? Drop that in the comments. If these are the stories you come here for, the real history behind the places that shaped American summers, subscribe.